Peace and love. Welcome back, everybody. Bro Sanchez speaking. I have a lot to go over with you guys today, so I'm going to hop right into it. What I'm about to share with you today is very, very important. We're going to be dealing with a lot of history here, and this history is the foundation of mostly all of our consciousness communities as well as all world religions. Today, we're going to be dealing with pre-dynastic history. Pre-dynastic history simply means before recorded history, before history started being recorded upon paper. Now, what we must keep in mind about pre-dynastic history is that when we say nothing was recorded on paper, doesn't mean nothing was recorded. Because if statues and figurines and building structures count, then history has always been recorded. So when we talk about pre-dynastic history, we're talking about the part of history that hasn't been fully interpreted by scholars. We're going back to a part of history where we're not dealing with written history, but symbols, pictures, and images and figures. And one can only ponder at this time what was the mindset of the people. This is the part of history no one wants to deal with because you can only debate the paper. When the paper and the written history came into play, a lot of confusion started because the picture is worth 1,000 words and the symbol is worth 1,000,000 pictures. You can't really argue with a figurine or a symbol, but you can interpret or misinterpret and translate the written word to cause all kind of confusion on paper. And therefore we live in a world where because of the written word, we have to have all kind of translators and contract interpreters and contracts, and it's a lot of deception. And when the world started to record history in a written word, that was the beginning of the New World Order and the deception. Because the first people who started to record history did it for evil agendas. So when they recorded it, they didn't record it accurately. And this goes all the way back to the early Kemetic people who we worship so dearly in Black conscious communities. And this goes back to the early dynasties of Egypt. When history started being recorded, the people started being deceived. The first people who started recording history back in ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, the whole agenda behind it was to create Pharaoh worship. And we still worshiping pharaohs today. And I will prove to you guys later in this series that Amen-Ra is nothing but the Greek god Zeus. People in the Black conscious community is still worshiping Jesus in the form of Amen-Ra. And again, I will be doing a future video getting into that. So when we talk pre-dynastic, we're talking about before written history. But a lot of pre-dynastic cultures left a lot of intelligent art behind that disproves the idea that pre-dynastic people were primitive. Let's get something in our head, people. When we talk about the dynasties of ancient Kemet, we're still talking about a time where deception was rampant on that land. Even when you deal with the very first dynasty under MENES, we're talking about a time where government was being created and rulership under dynastic families was being orchestrated upon the people. Prior to this, Ma'at ruled the land, and that was the law of the land, or what we call sovereignty amongst all people. So just the fact that we're in dynastic period in our Kemetic consciousness communities, we're not all the way back to pre-dynastic time. So when we say pre-dynastic, we're saying before any dynasties. When you talk about the first dynasties of Kemet under MENES, you're talking about the very first beginnings of the New World Order. This is what you have to realize. We're talking about kingdoms, and this does not include queendoms. You see, when you talk about the first dynasty under MENES, this was also what they call the archaic period. This was around those first dynasties that we're talking about here. When we left the pre-dynastic era and Pharaoh worship started to become seen in society. Prior to this, again, was the goddesses, Ma'at, the law of the land. You didn't have a bunch of men ruling over you. The mothers was representative of Mother Nature who ruled over everybody equally. And the law of the land was the village raise a child, and we take care of those who wrong that village among the village. We didn't pay taxes and pay a bunch of folks to make laws for us. And I'm gonna show y'all how the world got to be this way, starting all the way back here in the first dynasties of Egypt. So understand that they love MENES in many cultures. And his reign of Egypt was from 3407 BC to 3346 BC. It was treated as the dawn of Egyptian civilization in many classical histories. So why do they start this here? It's just like the Bible. They start you off with Genesis when we know there's something prior to that in the beginning that they give us. Same thing here. We keep going back and we thinking we getting to the beginning, but we're not at the beginning, people. And I'm going to take us all the way back to the beginning here. So let's deal with MENES first in this first dynasty, because a lot of people think they at the beginning of history and they start talking ancient when they dealing with MENES, and we're not even pre-dynastic. So MENES is who they give this credit to hide the mother goddesses. So in earlier Egyptian lore, he was called Ohi and Mina, the fighter, and then was referred to as the established. There's a lot of deception surrounding MENES that I will be getting into in future videos. So they call him the established to sort of give him the attributes and credit of donning the Egyptian civilization during this time. But like I said, I'm going to prove to you that there was intelligent civilization prior to this. This just marks the rule of structure and order, and you being ruled over on the pharaohs. And the presidents and the rulers today are nothing more than male rulers, the pharaohs that's keeping this same structure going today. When we go back to the mother goddess concepts, it goes back to sovereignty and mother nature. So MENES was the king from Upper Egypt who was the traditional founder of the United Egypt. He overthrew the government of the Northern Delta in about 3200 BC and started the first dynasty. He came from MENES, in which I'll be discussing the MENES era or the MENES confederation here in a minute. So understand that everything we understand about MENES comes from a story that was told by the Egyptian historian Manetho, who lived around 200 BC. And when you start researching about Manetho, there's a bit deception going on here with this history. And we're going to get into that in a minute when we get into Manetho. I want to stay on subject. So as we deal with MENES here, remember that his dynasty was during the Ptolemaic period. And when we talk about the unification, we're talking about the first blending of the patriarchs or the males with the laws of the land or the Ma'at mother system. There was nobody on a throne prior to the pharaohs, because when we talk about the rule of the goddesses, this was just when the world was living in village type states, and the great grandmother and the great mothers passed down history through story and passed down knowledge through storytelling and sciences of the earth and medicine and all of that. And this is where we get the term oracle from. You notice in all of the depictions of any oracle, it's older women. And that's because back then, this was the structure of the society, a village type setting. Even the elderly men had this certain respect for the queen bee or the grandmother, what we call mother dear. Okay, there's no term in our society called father dear. The great grandmother is called mother dear or mother dear, because she's that personification of mother nature during these pre-dynastic times. And she carried all of this science and cosmology throughout all of the society. And everyone in the village or the societies had a reverence for the mothers. This was prior to any of the male patriarch deities in the stories that we get, where they ruling us with fear and throwing us into lakes of fires. This was beautiful religion, beautiful spirituality that was directly linked to mother nature and personified in your mother and your grandmother. The atmosphere around these villages, it was sort of what we see in a beehive. And that'll get into a lot of the bee symbolism and the bee goddess worship later that we still find even in the dynastic period. We still can see the goddesses being revered. So it took a lot of time to fully remove the goddesses or the pre-dynastic remnants. And today we all male full patriarchy everywhere, even in the black Kemetic communities where you only hear Pharaoh talk and Ra this, Ra that, and Amun, Atum-Re worship, sun worship. Everyone forgot about the moon. But as we get deep into this, we're going to reveal the goddess more and more because she have been hidden by pharaonic worship. So when we talk the unification and this credit that they give to Narmer or MENES, because another alias for MENES is Narmer. Narmer and MENES are the same person. And I'm going to be getting into Narmer and MENES here and revealing a little of that deception in Manetho. Because when they give you this history, it's all an attempt to give you just enough to hide the pre-dynastic remnants and concepts of the original goddesses. And I told y'all the original wars was gender wars where they was hiding all of these sciences of the mother and creating Pharaoh worship. And the males was getting on the thrones, changing the mythologies to suit male and sun worship. Prior to this, it was a peaceful state where Ma'at and Mother Nature and the mythologies supported the village and the perseverance of nature and sovereignty amongst all people. We only rule today because we choose to be ruled. You elect your ruler. Same thing was happening during these first dynasties, and they hide this deception under these characters like MENES and Narmer. And again, I'm going to be getting into that. So before the first dynasty, Egypt was two lands. It was becoming a rise of patriarchal concepts that divided the people. And you had these cults that was going around being practiced where people were straying away from the laws of the mothers and the laws of nature, and ego was rising, and that was these male groups and cults arising even before this first dynasty. So it led up to this two lands of this matriarch versus patriarch, but prior to this, it was all Mother Nature, a matriarch. So the map in front of you will kind of give you an idea what we mean about Egypt before this unification. And you can see here Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And many may say, hey, why is Lower Egypt at the top and Upper Egypt at the bottom? It's because the flow of the Nile. They named the different parts of Egypt not based upon what we consider geographic. Everything was centered around the Nile. Because remember, the Nile was very spiritual at this time. The Nile River was the microcosm, cosmic womb. And if you look at this map, you can see it's shaped like a vagina. And it has the umbilical cord going down, feeding all of the children of the Nile. And the ancestors based everything in the culture around the Nile. Even their calendar was based around the Nile River. So the Nile River was very sacred then, and it still is now. And Lower Egypt is at the top and Upper Egypt is at the bottom during this time because of the flow of the Nile. The people perceive their reality on a foundation of their spirituality. Their very sense of direction emanated from their spirituality, which was all based around the Nile River at this time. So basically, when you look at this map, you can also see that you have Memphis near Cairo and Giza, and this is where all of the worship goes down at today. So all of the Pharaoh worship that we see in modern Kemetic communities is centered around these areas of Giza, Memphis. And what you got to realize during this patriarch and matriarch clashing at this time, the original laws of Ma'at was being taken away because of the pharaohs was trying to get rid of the law of the land, people, and they succeeded. And today, a lot of folks going around in the Kemetic communities thinking they conscious, but they preaching to you history that glorifies sellout pharaohs. These guys naming their whole movements Amen-Ra and naming themselves after sellout pharaohs. They're naming themselves and basing their whole Kemetic greatness and all of that history, giving this credit, and they're only digging back to the dynastic era, which was the Ptolemaic era. So what do Brother Sanchez mean? Even in our black conscious communities, we still ain't free, y'all. You still worshiping Jesus if you worshiping Amen-Ra. because he's just a form of Zeus. So understand there was a time where these different groups of pharaohs was battling Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And the compromise was they just blended all of these deities together. And it all centered around a deity because that's what was the law was centered around. Prior to any male deity, again, you see all of these pre-dynastic figurines of the mother, which represents just the law of the land, nature. You didn't have no rules over you. You was free. You was sovereign. These first dynasties marks the pharaohs ruling over you in a government type setting that we still lost in today. And it's all with the male patriarchy worship, guys. If you look at this map in front of you, you can see they got Memphis here in America and Tennessee. And they tell you all about Alexander the Great. You can see his city up there, Alexandria and Rosetta, where they supposedly got their little Rosetta Stone. I'll be doing a future video on that. So basically wanted to show you this map to give you that understanding and to understand that we're talking patriarch versus matriarch here. We're talking about a group of people who want to keep the law of the land and these male cults going around even before Rome even rose to power. We were still going around creating this new world order system. So that's what I'm telling y'all. The matrix is old. And according to folk tales, MENES, also thought to be Narmer, is the first mortal king. Think about this, people. MENES, they say he's the first mortal king after the rule of the gods. Okay, after the rule of the gods united these two lands, MENES is the first mortal king. So when the patriarch and matriarch was blended, there was a compromise. During this time, the pharaohs sat upon the throne. Remember, prior to this, there was no throne. When the women ruled, it was only in the law of Mother Nature. The woman was revered in all of the villages. Her throne was simply the center of a circle. We sat around circles, and the history was passed word of mouth through the oracles. Later came through the griots, and everything started being passed through the males. But what was being passed during this time was corruption, patriarchy, to keep the male dominance going, that keeps the structure going. The law of the land is in the mother, the Maatian concepts. So you see that MENES was the first mortal king. After this patriarch, matriarch compromise, this blending, now we get this first dynasty where we still see a lot of mother goddess concepts in reverence to the pre-dynastic goddesses. But you see the pharaohs ruling, and you'll see a lot of deities that look feminine, and even the pharaohs have a lot of feminine dress on. This all goes back to the divine feminine concepts that they was using to rule at this time, because it didn't just happen like a light switch cutting on. It was a process which led up to these first dynasties, and we're giving this story through MENES, which is questionable. And again, a unification of these two lands is just the matriarchy being blended with the patriarchy, and a compromise being made where the mothers are being removed, and the male dynasties or kingdoms are being set up now. Because prior to this, the queendom is the beehive concept, Mother Nature, the queen bee. So this is important to know, because MENES represents the first mortal king after the rule of the gods, which is the rule of the goddesses. They're never going to say goddess, okay? We're talking about patriarchal people. So when you're researching history, it's given to you by people who want to keep this patriarchal deception going. So you got to understand how to read and research and read between the lines. So when you hear MENES being the first mortal king, because prior to this, there was nobody who ruled over the masses in the flesh. Your ruler was your mother. Then after a certain age, you can rule yourself. Mother Nature rule you. And if you didn't do right by her, the law of Ma'at will get you. So it was nobody giving you laws, treating you like a slave. What they call today is structured civilization is really a slave system. But y'all thinking y'all waiting on the New World Order, and we already in it. The New World Order started in the first dynasty around the proto-dynastic period, when the pre-dynastic goddesses era ended. So MENES would be the first mortal king, or the first pharaoh that was being worshipped in the flesh. and these male patriarchs rose to power. Today it would be the Pope. Back then you can say MENES was the first Pope that overthrew the goddess concepts. So people in the Black conscious communities understand we got a lot to learn. Now I can get into MENES and I can get into NARMR and I can get into MENES, but I don't want to deal with that anymore at this time. I want to keep it moving because I will skip back in the future and do videos just on this. So just for the sake of you guys understanding the correct time reference that we're going to be dealing with here, we're going to be dealing with the pre-dynastic period, which ended around 3100 BC when the first dynasties began. And that would mark the beginning of the early dynastic period, what many call the old kingdoms. So everything prior to 3100 BC is what we call pre-dynastic. And everything prior to that date goes back hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Also understand when we're dealing with this time period, time was being counted backwards. So before I go any further, please lock that into your head. So when I refer to time shifts and time dates in this video and I say something like from the years of 3100 BC all the way up to the year of 2000 BC, don't get confused and say, hey, Brother Sanchez, what do you mean you counting up but the year is going down? That's on purpose. During this time, time was being counted backwards. So keep that in your head as we get deep into this series, and there's an agenda for that. Basically, the people who wrote about this time period we're referring to now, they was rewriting history and forging history. So you got to decipher this stuff. You wonder why they was counting time backwards. And they said Jesus split time because Jesus hid most of this history is hidden in the Bible. That's why there's two histories in the world. Okay, the religious one and the real historical world history. So understand the reason we're counting time backwards when we deal with this era is because the people who wrote about this era during the time they was writing about it, they was also undoing the calendars, and along with them hiding this history and recreating the calendars and all of that, it was a long period of time where a lot of this stuff I'm gonna be showing you was hidden, and it's just coming out in our time. It's been coming out lately in the world. It's a concept called syncretism that everyone in the pre-dynastic ancient world practiced, and they all were synced under this one deity that we call today the mother goddess. And I'm going to be giving y'all the history of the mother goddess and how all of these Kemetic folks deceived because they're not going back pre-dynastic in these conscious communities. They're starting with MENES. They're starting in the early dynastic period talking about ancient Kemetic. You're not talking about no ancient history if you starting off in the early dynastic period. If anything your teacher talking about he can go to and it's written down on paper and it's written, he's not giving you ancient history. There's nothing you can discuss that's ancient that's got anything to do with written papyrus or anything. When we go pre-dynastic, we're talking ancient. We're talking sculptures and figurines and symbol, not written words and written paper. So anybody talking ancient to you going into written text, they're not going into nothing ancient. They're going into deception because the people who first started writing stuff down, they did it to create the Pharaonic age where the royal family still rule the world today. Those early dynasties were dynastic families whose bloodline is still in the world today, and it's of all races ruling all races. And it's all races at the top ruling all races at the bottom, haves versus have-nots, but the illusion won't let you see that because they got us divided and conquered. So when we dealing with written text, we want to deal with it always like investigators and never like hook, line, and sinker idiots. And this is what happened, unfortunately, in a lot of these communities. They give up the Bible and their head gets so big, they think they know so much. And they get all of this history, but they realize this history coming from the same deceivers. So the same investigative mind that led them away from the Jesus trick they fail to utilize when they get into these conscious communities because they think it's over now. But if you always stay intuitive and investigative, you'll see that the rabbit hole always go deeper and deeper. So a lot of folks stuck in the raw cult and the comedic cults, and they stuck in the dynastic cults. But on this channel, we going back pre-dynastic, because pre-dynastic represent the time before written text, where the symbols and pictures were worth 1,000 words, and there was not much room for deception that came along with those written texts during the dynastic periods or the recorded history periods. The whole taboo about pre-dynastic people being primitive and nothing you can learn from this, and pre-dynastic time is not a popular teaching, is because it's been hidden that the truth is there. So whenever you're dealing with written texts, remember, written texts always have to be deciphered. Anything written must be deciphered. Whereas when you're dealing with symbolism, it automatically resonates with you on your level of consciousness. All you have to do to tune into the message and do the deciphering at that point is ignore all of the dumb written theories that they give you associated with the symbol, and understand that the symbols mean many things to many people. So understand, when we talk pre-dynastic, we're talking about the evidence of ancient people that can't be argued with, because the picture is worth 1,000 words and the symbol is worth 1,000,000 pictures. We can argue with the interpretation of the metadata and the interpretation of this text or that text. And the reason we're in confusion and chaos, because the people who created the written text created it for that reason, to create confusion. The written text was when the word started getting secret and your cult started coming into play, and certain people couldn't read the text, but certain people could. But when we talk pre-dynastic, before all of the rulership, before all of the pharaohs, when we go back, we're talking about a cosmic code that was shared by every individual in the society. We're talking about ma'at. We're talking about ballots. And this is what they want to hide from you. Nobody want to deal with the pre-dynastic period. So with everything being said, let's deal with the facts and let's deal with pre-dynastic history. So the pre-dynastic period of ancient Egypt is the period prior to 3100 BC, and is traditionally the period between the early Neolithic and the beginning of the pharaonic monarchy, starting with King Narmer. However, the dates of the pre-dynastic period were first defined before widespread archaeological excavation of Egypt had taken place, and recent finds, which showed the course of pre-dynastic development to have been very gradual, have caused scholars to argue about when exactly the pre-dynastic period ended. Thus, the term proto-dynastic period, sometimes called Dynasty Zero, has been used by scholars to name the part of the period which might be characterized as pre-dynastic by some and dynastic by others. So to sum that up for you guys, what this is saying is that the transition between pre-dynastic and dynastic period is a gray area exactly when exactly history went from pre-dynastic history to the first dynasties. That transition, that gray area, or that time gap where we roughly can estimate when this transition occurred, is called the proto-dynastic period, or Dynasty Zero. And that period is between 3100 BC and 3000 BC. That 100-year time span is sort of the transitioning era from pre-dynastic to the early dynastic period. The pre-dynastic period is generally divided into cultural periods named after the places where a certain type of Egyptian settlement was first located. However, the same gradual development that characterizes the proto-dynastic period is present throughout the entire pre-dynastic period. And individual cultures must not be interpreted as separate entities, but as largely subjective divisions used to facilitate easier study of the entire period. And I'm going to get deep into that as we move on. So again, the proto-dynastic period of Egypt refers to the period of time at the very end of the pre-dynastic period, equivalent to the archaeological phase known as Nakata Third. And there were three phases of Nakatas: Nakata first phase, Nakata second, and Nakata third. We're going to be getting into all of those phases and looking at all of these pre-dynastic cultures as we move on. So during the proto-dynastic period, Egypt took the first steps toward political unification, leading to a truly unified state during the early dynastic period. Also during this time, we see the Egyptian language first being recorded in hieroglyphs. So here's the first beginning of the dynastic period where history is beginning to be recorded. We say there was so much advancement and greatness during this time, but even during pre-dynastic times, there was high intelligence and high advances in civilization that we have not been told about. And we're going to get into that. History as you know it is bogus, people, and it's given to you to serve certain agendas. So when we talk about the first dynasties and the unification of Kemet, because right now we're dealing with pre-dynastic going into the early dynastic period, and these first couple of videos is dealing solely with pre-dynastic history. But when we deal with it, we're dealing with parts of the first early dynastic period as well because of that proto-dynastic period where we're transitioning from. So Brother Sanchez is just being thorough. We're going to deal with the early beginnings of recorded pre-dynastic history. And what I mean by that is we can prove that these pre-dynastic cultures existed based on the art, the figurines, and the structures that they left behind, even though they didn't have written history. Because, guys, what I'm finding out, the more I study pre-dynastic people, or what we call ancient people, I start to see that what we refer to as ancient Egypt really isn't ancient. It's really the beginning of the world order, starting with the Pharaohs. Everything prior to that was the Ma'at era, or the era of the goddess, is what you call world sovereignty. And the unification was really the blending of the matriarchs with the patriarchs. Because what we got to realize is that everything pre-dynastic is dealing with the goddesses, and everything that's dynastic is dealing with the gods like Ra and the pharaohs. It was not no racial thing during this time. It was a gender thing. So you don't hear about these early gender wars. And the gender war is the most biggest war on earth that we don't even discuss. And I'll get into that in future videos as well. But during this time, Mother Nature was being replaced with rulership. So the law of the land was being substituted, where you got men governing over you. And that's the same problem today. Men governing the world and creating chaos, because every one of them got their own evil agendas. And that was the whole beginning of the dynasties anyway. They was created to rule over people. And you given this history that it was created because it was the beginning of great thoughts and civilization. And Brother Sanchez is finding out more and more that even when you go to what they call pre-dynastic history, people were smart. People were still doing the same thing that we idolize the Egyptians for doing. But they don't want to go back to the pre-dynastic era because they're hiding syncretism. And I'm going to show y'all what I mean as we get deep into this. So they got everybody still in the egotistical patriarchal state. Even a lot of people that's thinking they consciousness, because we don't want to deal with the goddesses of the pre-dynastic world. So when Brother Sanchez talk ancient, I'm talking pre-dynastic. I'm not talking early dynastic like most of your so-called Kemetic scholars and teachers out here. So understand that there is also strong archaeological evidence of Egyptian settlements in southern Israel during the proto-dynastic period, which may have functioned as colonies. State formation began during this era with the rise of small city-states along the Nile. Centuries of conquest reduced Upper Egypt to three major states: Thenis, Nakata, and Nekhen. And again, we're going to be dealing with all of these different states, all of these different time periods in detail. And I'm going to leave this thing to where you can't mess it up. So sandwiched between Thenis and Nekhen, Nakata was the first of the Upper Egypt city-states to fall. Thenis then conquered Lower Egypt. Nechen's relationship with Thenis is uncertain, but the two states may have merged amicably with the Thinite royal family ruling the whole of Egypt. The Thinite kings were buried at Abydos in the now famous el-Ka'ab cemetery. Most Egyptologists consider Narmer to be the last king of the proto-dynastic period, although some experts place his reign during the first dynasty and the last of the so-called Scorpion kings, whose name may refer to or be derived from the goddess Serket, a special early protector of other deities and their rulers. When we talk about King Narmer, it's important to keep in mind that he is considered to be the last king of the proto-dynastic period, but some people place his reign during the first dynasty. So when we talk about the goddess Serket, this shows you that even during this time, we see the goddess present and inspiring the kings, even during the first so-called dynasties and kingdoms. Again, prior to this, it was matriarchal, it was a queendom, but it was balance. The lack of balance only came during the kingdoms and what we idolize as the dynasties in Egypt under all of these pharaohs. Remember, Ma'at is always a woman. The pre-dynastic period or the goddess era represent balance. It represents the time where it was truly the Garden of Eden. The farther back we go, the more we can see how corrupted we are now.